Welcome to the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast, a show dedicated to modern learning and development. With your hosts, Daniel Mendonca and Scott Babcock.
It's podcast day. Welcome to the show. This is If You Build It, Will They Learn? I'm Scott Babcock, and I'm here, as always, with your co-host, Daniel Mendonca. Daniel, how are you today?
Doing well, Scott. Happy March.
Happy March.
I can't believe it's the third month of the year, but it's an exciting time. Wife's birthday is this weekend, so, got
anything
big
fun planned?
To be honest with you, I'll get to my positivity point at the end, but yeah, it's we got fun things planned, but they have nothing to do with her birthday.
All right, there you go. Good times. All right, so on the show today, we've talked a little bit about the fact that in the month of March, we are going to focus on creativity, and last week we had our podcast with my boys, which was a lot of fun. We did find out that during some of our listens, people tended to drop off thinking probably, what in the heck are these guys doing, interviewing a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old. But we had a lot of fun with it, and that's what I think is important. So today we're going to get back into maybe a bit more of our normal routine and have a little fun talking about creative elements in the L&D space, why it's important, and some things you can do to kind of bring those to life as well. All right, so when we talk about creativity in the learning and development space, one of the things that we want to focus on today is how do you tap into a learner's creativity? And I think there's two ways we can look at that from the perspective of delivery and the way we design. And the first is probably more passive. How do we include a learner in the training so that they're starting to think creatively as they go to execute? And then a little bit more on the active side, how do they start to generate training opportunities for others? So let's focus on the first one, the passive side of this. And Daniel, do you have like a good example or something you think about when you think about the passive way to bring the creativity of a learner out in training?
Yeah, I think right at the start, it's really just including the learner in part of the learning journey and kind of sucking them in. I almost think about like those moments in movies or whatever it may be where like they like reach into this like forbidden vortex and they just get sucked right in. And I think that's what you want is you want them to be part of the story and be part of the journey. The best example I can think of, and Scott, you and I are guilty of this, actually the first 15 to 20 minutes, maybe longer sometimes, I'm sure Sabrina could talk about that, is theorizing and talking about fan theories and different things for some of the shows we like, Marvel movies, Mandalorian, other things. So if you think about a great movie or a TV show, when you're in an episode or you're watching, throughout it, your brain starts working about what's coming next. And then after you're done consuming the content, you're still thinking about like, how does this relate to what's going on with me? What do I think is going to happen next? How can I relate this to my everyday? And that is what we talk about passive. It's consuming them in the creative journey of the training and allowing the learner to start to facilitate their own thoughts around what could come next.
Yeah, I mean, the internet is full of exactly what we're talking about. Whenever any new TV series comes out or a movie that is in, especially in genres like superheroes or Star Wars or Star Trek or, these kind of very heavy fan bases, the internet goes wild with speculative concepts on who's going to be the next character that's introduced or where does this storyline take us in the greater arc of a whole series. And I think that's the goal. Like, how do you get a user to not leave the training on the table when they're finished with it, but start to carry it forward with themselves to apply that in their job? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the way that comes to light. But I think it's a great example of how passive creativity comes to play. I'll go a little bit on the more active side, and this is probably more literal when we talk about it, and maybe doesn't need a crazy analogy to go with it. But when we're talking about this, we're actually talking about users starting to contribute their voice to the training process. So whether that's feedback mechanisms and loops, are they taking part in surveys? Are they dialoguing with the L&D team on things they need or want or would like to see more of? Or are they actually, in some cases, potentially even generating content that is being delivered out? Are they building training programs? Are they providing job aids? Are they doing teachbacks in their stores or their organization? I think there's ways that those individuals can also it's probably more of a literal definition. They're actively participating in the process by contributing their own creativity on great new ideas.
Yeah, I think It's when you think about it and you talk about, I guess, actively contributing in the creative process, I think that's where you start to dip your toe into the social learning discussion of how you can engage. I think that um, some of the different spaces that we're in and we work in, I think at the end of the day, the user has the experience. I know that when I think about my players in a coaching perspective being part of the journey, when we have halftime team talks about ways we can adjust or things we need to take in and adapt to. Their perspective is always so good and of such high quality because they're in it. They're seeing the feedback. They're seeing I guess, the the cause and effect of different actions and different ideas. And I think that's where their active creative participation can be really beneficial to your learning strategy.
All right, so we talked a little bit about what we are kind of categorizing as passive and active creativity of your learner and how you tap into that a little bit. We're going to start to talk a little bit about why it's important. And that, I think, is really where we're going to probably focus a good chunk of today's dialogue is why? Why bother thinking about a learner's creativity when you're creating content for them? And I think some of it will seem pretty intuitive. We may go out on a limb once or twice to say why we also think it's important. But I think there's a lot of ways that you can have great impact in your training by thinking about the way a learner's creativity can come to the table. So let's start with maybe just the most on the front. I don't know if it's going to be the most intuitive, but the first thing I would say is obviously by bringing them in, you make them feel engaged and motivated. This is probably going to be a mix of both the passive and active if we assign sort of the design around it. But by bringing them into the table, giving them a voice in the process through the active side, you're helping them feel engaged in the process, which obviously gives them more buy-in. And then in terms of motivation, if they feel some creative energy coming out of the conversation, then they're more likely to want to continue to train, to want to take that message back and tell about what they've learned, or to just start to apply it even more regularly in their position or their job. So I think both passive and active work in that way and really help a learner want to stay a part of that training program.
Yeah, I think on the concept of engaged and motivated, when we talk about the modern learner, and millennials, let's say, are occupying, I don't know, I don't have the statistic off the top of my head, but a significant amount of the workforce nowadays. The reality is that empowerment is a huge component to their success and their satisfaction in their roles. And there's a lot of studies that show that. And part of empowerment is making sure their voice is heard. So by including them in the process, either actively or passively, you're going to see more satisfaction in the role, but also more buy-in. I think that the engaged and motivated part for me is if I'm going to go take that training or going to be more interested in taking something that is just recommended of me or maybe voluntary if I feel like I'm part of the process because and my organization respects my thoughts, my opinions, my takes on the learning part of what we do every day. So I think greater buy-in is a major part of it. But Scott, I wanted to kind of follow up with that. I guess when we talk about learning culture as a whole, um, there's obviously the concept of culture coming top down. I guess how do you have in this case specifically, how can you use the learners to build a good foundation for your learning culture?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is you have to, we talked about it, right? With that active voice, giving them some guidance and listening to them. I think that's got to be a huge part of how they get in there to help guide the overall strategy. Doing it all in a vacuum and making the assumption you're going to meet your learner's needs is probably not going to be the best. Whenever we're talking about any of this, where it's the feedback mechanism or including your learners in the process, I love a great dad cliche, but right, two minds are always greater than one. And the reality is the more insight and more voices you choose to listen to are ultimately going to bring around ideas. And that's really the topic when we think about creativity with our learners. That idea generation and not just either dismissing it because it's maybe out of the norm or like completely not giving them that option to include that, you're going to start to hear more and more ideas. And while some of them are going to be crazy and out there and maybe not really executable, from a strategy perspective, if you get even a few nuggets here and there that you can start to build on, those are ways you can really start to innovate your training and be more creative, or put some ingenuity into your learning and development program. All right, so we understand a little bit of why it's important to bring creativity, the learner's creativity to light. We understand a little bit about what that means. Let's talk about some ways in which you can start to implement some of these strategies as you're designing programs, materials, individual training items, things like that, and what we can do to maximize on that. So, Daniel, do you have like a good example to kick us off on ways to bring maybe some of that active involvement from a learner into the process?
I think the biggest way when you talk about, I guess, active participation comes down to narrative or scenario based learning, which can either be, participation based. I mean, in virtual ILTs, they can be role playing, or in person ILTs, they can be role playing or scenario based, where you're talking through different scenarios. I think the most common thing I could think of is, for me, obviously, is sales. So mock pitches, mock demos, creating scenarios where you're asking for feedback, and walking through that, filming that, allowing people to review that content over again, simulating how feedback could be given. I think that's one way. But then also, just in general, just creating those scenarios of your everyday, of like, how are you going to use a new software? How are you going to follow an SOP? Those actually scenarios to walk through. And the important thing with scenario training, to incorporate them in there, is asking the learners, okay, if you do this in this scenario, how does it affect what's next? How does it affect the customer? How does it affect your job, positively and negatively, including both of those? And when I think about scenarios, the biggest feedback I would give on scenarios is making sure they're realistic. So even if they end negatively and have a bad outcome, making sure that's said as well.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and I think my brain immediately went in a different direction, and that's okay. That's part of this dialogue, should be this. But you mentioned a lot of like the in-person training, and I think that's the part I hadn't really thought about is, when we talk about scenario-based training from an active perspective, specifically giving a user an opportunity to play a role, and whether it's in these role plays and stuff is great. I think if you want to apply that maybe one step further from a creativity perspective, offering them unique scenarios that are very different but applicable. So you mentioned like sales training or doing a pitch, and we've probably all been in an interview where we get asked some kind of wild or crazy question, but giving them a scenario that is not comfortable. So again, let's say they're selling computers for a living, asking them as part of the training to sell a banana or a pen or something that maybe is a little bit different for them and sparks that creativity. They have to think differently. They have to be nimble and agile as they go through that conversation, really react to what's happening. I think that's really beneficial to that learner in that moment. If I'm thinking digitally, one of the things that potentially is going to be really impactful for you in scenario bases, they're not going to have as much autonomy to make shifts and choices and to really adjust on the fly. But I think you can start to invite them into the training itself. Again, we talked about the immersive nature of movies and TV shows that kind of build that up. What you still want to come out of that training in that digital space is that they're thinking differently, thinking creatively, and that they start to apply that same notion back to their actual interactions they're having with customers. So I think you can have the same result, whether it's coming from an in-person training or a digital experience. And that creativity is going to be really important for those learners.
It's to be honest with you, I know we do all this planning for the podcast. I really didn't think I was going to go down the in-person training, but then I started to think, how scenarios affect my day-to-day, and our sales team meets weekly to go through those sorts of roles and responsibilities. But I think from the digital perspective, I think what you outlined is very true. I think letting them share their ideas, putting them down on paper. But one of the things I find in the self-paced digital format of training to recreate is exactly what you outlined: realism. And I think that it is difficult to you always want to walk down your learner down a garden path. And I know I say that a lot, so but we want to walk them down a garden path. But the reality of it is scenarios typically in your day to day are not all rosy and full of flowers. You hit roadblocks, and in a scenario, highlighting those roadblocks is difficult in the digital format. It's difficult to bring up the difficult. I've said difficult like 7 times in a row now, but it's a bit of an obstacle to put forth what happens when something negative occurs, and that is one of the ways we've seen. I know both of us have seen training, scenario-based training, fail or not do as well as it could. Is when they get in there and the learner is like, "This is not realistic." And I think that's where your learner feedback, going back to here's how you could incorporate it, getting their feedback ahead of time related to your objectives is so important to being successful.
Yeah, one of the things that I think you can employ from a tactic or a strategy that is one of my personal favorite things when it comes to training to help people think creatively, excuse me, is the idea of storytelling and having a narrative to your stories. And you hit on it, the realism that comes with an experience or the scenario. So if you're going to put someone in a situational training moment and help them start to think differently, you have to put realism. Not every story ends with a happy ending, and not every story is happy all the way through. That's probably the more realistic part of this. There's going to be obstacles and hurdles that your character or your participant has to go through to try to succeed. A story that just where everything falls into line and everything goes perfectly well and the path is smooth typically isn't as interesting. And to your point, a learner quickly recognizes this doesn't look like my day-to-day experience. And when you're doing these scenarios, I think so often we want to show what a perfect version of that looks like, but that's hard for a learner to really put into perspective because that's not what they've ever experienced. As much as we'd like to believe we've set out the ground rules for everything to go great, there's going to be people who don't agree with the concept or a system that doesn't perform the way you had hoped, or the internet goes out or whatever. Like there's a lot of hurdles in life that are just real. And I think giving learners an opportunity to see that you understand what they're going through on a regular basis also puts them in a frame of mind where they can start to think about how would I overcome that obstacle, try to have that creative moment where they're trying to be better or make a decision that would help them out.
I think even incorporating your learners in that process, and kind of in the last point you just made, is part of their training. I think asking that question of how would you overcome that obstacle, and I always find that for myself when I'm in a scenario for my role, I tend to I believe that I'm nimble and quick and I can think on the go and I'm solutions oriented. I actually struggle more. Like I think back to like the Wolf of Wall Street, the movie, where he's like, sell this pen, right? And you brought it up earlier. I don't know how I would do in that moment, but when I'm in a general conversation, I tend to come up with those objectives and I can hit on the solutions that are necessary. So I think that's part of the training process also. Speaking to your team about what the objectives are and being like, how would we overcome this? And then being able to put that down on paper or having them record themselves saying it via in demo or format. I think those items really kind of encapsulate including your learner and allowing their creativity to shine through.
Yeah, and I think the last thing, at least I'll say on this, unless we start to, this may blossom into a whole nother conversation, you never know. But my intention is that I will move on after this. But I think when we talk about the passive side of creativity and learners, I think we've talked a lot about how a learner can immerse themselves in the story. But how do you start to give them some active voice in your process? And I think ways to bring around a community feedback loop, whether that's in the platform itself to let them dialogue things out or have discussion threads, whether it's opening up surveys and polls through other means and softwares. Give your learner a chance to contribute back on what they like, what they dislike, what they wish they had more of. And I think you're going to find you'll get some great ideas. It was as we were talking through this, I was watching the Golden Globes this week, and Jane Fonda won an award. I don't honestly remember what the award was, but I was listening to her speak, and she talked a lot about the idea that movies are great ways to motivate and make people feel emotion about a topic. And often they drive some form of action from the audience because, again, it makes them feel and it makes them believe. And I think the same thing can be true of a training element. I don't want to give it that you're going to create the next movie of the year motion picture drama, but the reality is, I think if you spark some concepts within the people who are taking your content, they'll start to take that forward and act differently to motivate others to react and make decisions that are smarter or more aligned to a strategy or to a company goal. And I think that's where that active voice of contribution can also come in. They can start to tell you, this is the thing I care about. How do we start to train others to start to care about it too? And again, spark that emotion, spark some activity from your learners, and really help them take sort of their own destiny in their hands to start to do some of this training. All right, we understand what creativity is, why we should do it a little bit, what we're going to be doing to do it, how we are going to go around engaging the creativity of our learners, but what's the end impact? What do we believe you get from doing it? So what is the big payoff? What are the results? That's really what probably drives us to say this might be worthwhile and I really need to focus on this. And so we want to spend some time on a few of the things that ultimately you will likely experience from really sparking your learners' creativity in the training itself, whether it's passive, whether it's active. I think you're going to see some results from both. So the first word we're going to throw out, and it has double meaning, so we'll each take one side of it, is the word retention. And I think retention is going to be twofold. I'm going to go first, and then I'll let Daniel pick up the other side of retention. But from retention itself, we're going to talk about the knowledge retention. People who are engaged in their training and feel more motivated and are feeling a part of the training program are going to retain that material longer. Now, that's going to come from a couple of ways. One, they're just more bought into the process. We talked about that they feel more involved. And so they have a passion around it and they have some energy around it. They're going to retain that information. The other part of retention that I think is really important, we've mentioned a little bit, is are they taking that training forward? Do they go teach that to someone else? Do they start to share that message with a greater team or a greater audience? Those are ways that learners will start to retain. So when you do a teach back from having retained and learned material, you're likely to retain that material longer because you're starting to disseminate, you're repetitively mentioning it, you're bringing it back up. We know that works. So when someone does a teach back, they're also going to retain the information longer, and that's a win for your company.
I think that's a huge win, Scott. And I think it goes right along with the other side of retention, which is employee retention. So we talked about this before, but I think with the modern employee, they're a little bit contradictory in the sense that they approach the jobs in a different way, in the sense that they are jobs to them, and they're willing to move on if they're not feeling satisfied in their role, or they're not being empowered or engaged with in that, which is all the things we talked about earlier. But at the same time, I think the modern employee more than ever is loyal and looking to move up within organizations, looking to ways to better themselves. If the organization is on their side, they tend to be very loyal in that way. So in this case, we're talking about employee retention. So if you engage with them, if you include them in the process and in their journey, you're going to see the moments where employees stick around longer. They start to help you and own the training process and be engaged with it with the department that they're in. They feel more open to job shadows and things of that sort if they're involved in the overall process, which is a huge thing. And as we know from a human resource perspective, people and culture perspective, hiring new employees is a lot more expensive than retaining and training your existing employees. So that's number one. But number two, obviously, constantly going through the onboarding education process with people, because you can't retain your employees, is exhausting for managers and directors and other team members. So that employee retention, from bringing them along for the ride in the creative journey, having them be part of the training process, and right from day one too. I think one of the most enlightening things I always have seen, and we've hired a lot of people in the past 18 months at Halite, is the feedback and the opinion on some of the things we do, whether it's our onboarding, whether it's our training, whether it's our products and services, from somebody who's been at the company for 10 days. and doesn't know any better and has never been an L&D, maybe they're just graduated out of school. I always find those opinions refreshing and eye-opening for us and allows us to be better. So I think it's great from an employee retention perspective and kind of for the success of your company.
You mentioned culture in there a couple of times, and I think that is a part of this as well, right? So when we think about the learning culture of your organization, if you're looking to improve that, a great way is to get people bought back into the program and letting them be either part of the dialogue and the progress is a great way to help improve your culture and empower those people to stick around because they're going to be contributing on a regular basis. And I think that also plays into that. When you feel empowered through the training program, through the learning culture of your organization, you're going to be more open to the idea of that take it forward moment. So I've taken training. Am I willing to go be a voice to my peers? Am I willing to go take this and make decisions that are smarter on behalf of my company, because my company clearly is invested in the culture of learning for our organization. And look, that's another win opportunity for you as well.
I think on the culture note, and I'm a big company environment, company culture, obviously from a team perspective with coaching, I think that's a big part of. I am a firm believer that culture in learning and in anything really can be guided by leadership, but it is in fact developed, owned, and grown by the employees. And all leaders can do, managers, directors can set them down the path, the garden path per se, or completely derail them. And I think in this case, it allows everybody to be involved in owning that partnership and owning that culture direction and allowing it to grow, prosper, and evolve into, a very successful environment.
All right, so we spent a lot of time talking about creativity in the learning space, specifically thinking about your learners' creativity and how you can utilize that to better improve your training. Hopefully you found some nuggets in there that are really interesting, maybe even some wisdom. Who knows? So with that, we want to wrap up today, as we always do, with a positivity point, a little something to bring some energy and excitement and positivity back into the day, and just share what's going on a little bit with us on maybe a more personal level. So Daniel, why don't you go ahead and kick us off today on the positivity point?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'm going to circle back to what I mentioned at the start of the pod. My wife's birthday is Sunday, which I'm not going to say how old she's turning. She would kill me if I did that, but I'll tell you that it's always an exciting time. She loves her birthday, and we're excited for it. I, as a fantastic husband that I am, have booked a 48-hour fundraiser that I want to kind of dive into, because this is the positivity point. There's some, I don't know, some of you may know who David Goggins is, motivational speaker, ex-military, super triathlete, marathon runner. He has a 4x4x48 challenge that goes on every year. And what that is you run 4 miles or exercise for 4 miles, let's say, every 4 hours for 48 hours straight. So it turns out that you move 48 miles. And both the men's and women's soccer teams at the University of Windsor are undertaking that challenge as a group. They've been raising money. And in the 12 days that we've been raising money now, we just this morning crossed over the $12,000 mark that we've raised for a Black, Indigenous, people of color scholarship at the University of Windsor Human Kinetics Department. So I am bringing this up my positivity point because not only am I going to get active for 48 miles this upcoming weekend, right through my wife's birthday. She's super thrilled about that. I'm probably going to complain about being sore, but I'm extremely proud of 50 young men and women who have put time in and effort in to raise over $12,000 for a scholarship, which is a great cause. So very, very proud of our group. And that's my positivity point. Next week, I'll probably talk about how my legs still are sore come, Tuesday or Wednesday. So
that is an awesome positivity point. Super proud of everything you guys are doing as well. You mentioned that March is a bit of a month of some activities going on, right? So some change between birthdays and your running. So it's baseball season is back in Tennessee land. So growing up where I did in Minnesota, like the idea of getting onto a baseball field in the next 3 months isn't likely, given all the snow that they likely still have on the field. But we are out and about. And this year, I actually, I don't know, we'll see how it goes. But I took over as one of the coaches on my son's baseball travel team. So last night we had our first on the field practice. We did a hitting practice. It's camp before we lead into our first tournament. And my positivity point is one that I'm having a blast and I'm really enjoying it. And the kids are great and it's just a fun experience. So I wanted to share that, but I have a funny story that goes with it. So obviously we got some snow here in Tennessee, as most of the country I think did in the last few weeks. And then we had massive rains all last week. So everything is still a bit soggy and wet. And we were doing an agility drill at my station last night during practice. And I was trying to show the kids like how to shift and get your body going in the right direction to quickly change directions, to go react to a ball getting hit. And so as I was mocking it out, feeling very macho as an adult, not wearing cleats, clearly that's the problem, I went ahead and went to stop on my cone, and it was just, I hit a mud slick just right. And like head over tea kettle, my feet went out from underneath me. I slammed onto my back. Now I'm 41. I'm going to be paying for this tomorrow, I think, as my body goes, what's wrong with you? That in and of itself was fun. I think the kids laughed, whatever. But my wife wasn't at practice. She was helping prepare for them to get all their stuff. And one of the boys went to go pick up his mom, who was helping out with all of that with his dad. And he told the story of what happened to me to my wife. And to hear the way this young man went ahead and told the story, very simply put, he said, yeah, Coach Scott was teaching us how to break down, and he broke down. And that was just how he summed it up. And so it was great. Like I say, a little embarrassing moment for Coach, but it's still funny to listen to it happen. And again, great time, lots of fun, super excited for the season as we move forward. So
that's a great story, Scott. And to be honest with you, if I wouldn't be honest if I didn't tell you I've had a fair share of slips and falls in my day as well. Always a reminder on those slippery days, you gotta put cleats on.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to invest in a pair of cleats for myself. So, all right, that will do it for us today. I'm Scott Babcock. He's Daniel Mendonca, and we will talk to you next week.
Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Join the conversation by emailing us at podcast@haylight.com. Find us on social media at Build It, Learn It, and be sure to check us out on the web at www.haylight.com. That's HALIGHT.com.